first
So
video?
afterwards. So
All the
after the
videos
whole
are after.
panel, then
Okay.
I come,
Then you
some
show
kind
a
of
video.
comments, then Kevin speaks.
Right.
We have the first conversation about the first question,
Uh-huh.
and then comes the
The video. Okay. Perfect. Yes, but I could. But if you want to, I'll ask you for one word, and then I'll say, "And why did you pick that word?" You can give me like 2 sentences on why you picked that word. Yeah, and so why did you pick heat? And then you'll just. Well, you could just say because I live, in Arizona, and extreme heat is our biggest problem. Yeah. Just for context. Yeah. And actually, you know what? I'll speak to Yeah. No, it's so funny. I'm sure I've been in similar circles for so many times. Yes.
Especially because a lot of my colleagues who mentioned over 20
Well, I'm a climate scientist.
yeah,
So most of my engagement was actually not climate change. Oh, climate science. Hi. Hey. Yes, that was so long ago. Oh my god.
yeah, it was like before pandemic, yeah.
I know.
So,
BC.
anyways, I just wanted to say hi. This is I'm part of the
Yes, I know. I had to add to my bio. It was my only module. I had that replaced. But I have, but I actually have been, so both, we moved to Hudson and also just all of living in Dallas. And so, hi. Translational. Hey. No, thank you. Yeah. To Spanish, no. Okay.
I'll be fine.
Yes.
Translation. I'm here with do you know many other people in your cities?
Yeah, I know a fair amount. I mean, obviously
I'm
Jessica.
yeah, I'm here with Jessica.
Oh, Jessica's here too. Oh, that's awesome. Oh my gosh.
With a lot of the adaptation, she's probably written all the like starting at 10:30. There's a lot of adaptation negotiation and reports out.
Oh,
So
very cool.
I'm actually there's another scaling here that I'm trying to decide if I'll niche out for those too. So yeah, she's been here. The two of us have also been
Oh,
like having our professor hats on because we're the two people who are grad students. So we've been like trying to actually they just Jessica and someone else just
oh, that's really cool.
we took them all out to dinner and then
Oh, awesome.
Jessica and I caught like two of them out by themselves last night.
Oh, that's so cute. I should probably get started, but that's awesome. Yes. And if I don't see Jessica, say hi to me. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Is this on? Yes, this is on. Okay. Please take a seat and we will get started. Yes, there's 3 of us. Or 4. Kevin's going later. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can take my bag away if you want. We don't need my bag. Thank you, Kevin. All right, and so you can use that microphone right there. Yes.
Hello, good morning. Okay.
All right, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for showing up on an early Saturday morning. This is being live streamed and it is being recorded for sharing and use later. My name is Catherine Hayhoe. I am the Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And I am really delighted to be hosting this panel for you here today. I'm a climate scientist, and I study how quickly the planet is changing and how fast we have to adapt. We know from looking at the history of the planet that we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. We have never seen climate changing this quickly. And we know it is not about saving the planet, it is about saving us. And by us, I mean us humans and every living thing on this planet that is forced to adapt many times faster than any time in the past. So when we talk about resilience and adaptation, it doesn't look the same in different parts of the world, because adaptation depends on how vulnerable we are, how exposed we are, and what type of climate impacts we're experiencing. And with this panel, we'll discuss the different ways that climate change is manifesting itself in different places around the world. So to introduce our panelists, our first panelist is Councilwoman Yasemin Ansari, and she is the youngest woman ever elected to the Phoenix City Council, the city of Phoenix in Arizona. It is the fifth largest, yes. It is the fifth largest and fastest growing city in the United States. And this is very interesting because you would assume because of climate change, people are moving away from hot, dry locations. And Phoenix is pretty much the hottest and driest city that you can move to. But studies have shown, and there was that Duke study a few years ago where they studied where people are moving to. People are moving to Phoenix, which, as we'll learn, is very challenged with heat and drought. But it's no surprise that you were elected because she has so much experience. She was a policy advisor on the climate teams of both the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Antonio Guterres, and she was an advisor to Christiana Figueres. If that was the first third of your life, I can't wait to see what the next 2/3 look like. Our next panelist is Rinal Kanti Tripura. He is the director of the Malaya Foundation and coordinator of the Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Network on Climate Change and Biodiversity. He is an indigenous person from the Chittagong Hill tracts of Bangladesh and belongs to the Tripura people. Our third panelist is Niala Frederick. Niala is the Climate Change Project Manager for the Eastern Caribbean Program. She's from the island of Grenada. She has worked with the Nature Conservancy since 2013 and previously worked with the government of Grenada as an architect. So the perfect combination of people and nature. I want to start off by asking each of our panelists a very challenging question. And the reason it's challenging is because I've asked them to answer with one word. How many panels have you seen here that have asked for one-word answers? None. All right. But I'm going to give them a little bit of a break. I'm going to ask them for one word, and then they can have 2 sentences on why they chose that word. All right. So when I say, and I'm going to start here and go down the line, just so you know, so you can prepare. When I say climate change, what is the first word that comes to mind for you where you live?
Heat. Hello. All right. Heat is the first word. And the reason is because, as you mentioned, Phoenix is very quickly and becoming one of the fastest warming cities in the United States.
Good answer. So heat. Now, when I ask you one word for where you live, we actually talked before, and he made a really good argument for 2 words. So give us your first word. What's your first word?
It's destruction.
Why is that?
Because when we see the climate change, we see something bad, storm, flood. So it destructs the houses because we live in the vulnerable ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's destructive for us.
But then your second word
Yes,
was?
is also an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Because through this climate change, when we see all these destructive things, all this crisis, it also gives us an opportunity to address the irregularities, the corruption, the wrong systems we are in. So that's why I think it's also an opportunity. But the thing is, we need to know how to use this as an opportunity. That's why. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that. So climate solutions can be solutions for a better future. And right now, we need to be looking for the solutions that have win-win-win-wins, just like you said. All right. What is your word?
Catherine, can I have 2 words as well, or 3?
Oh,
We're coming down the line.
Three. I'm not sure about that. Well, okay, since you're third, all right.
Okay.
Fine.
No, I'm going to do 1 word, and I think my 1 word for me is tragedy.
Tragedy.
Where I live, small island state. It's a small island state, and we all know that small islands are the least polluters, the least contributors to what is happening in terms of climate change, but we are bearing the brunt. And for me, it's a tragedy to see what is happening in my home country and the ones surrounding.
Yes, that's a good answer as well. So now, they're applauding you too. So I study how climate change is affecting each part of the world, and I've worked in many places around the world. And so I wanted to now ask each of you, starting here and coming back, to tell me a little bit about how climate change is affecting people in your community, and especially how it's affecting people differently. Because we know that climate change affects everyone, but it doesn't affect us all the same. And often people who are already vulnerable, who are already marginalized, are affected more than people who are not. So in the Caribbean, I know that oceans are warming, and that is affecting coral reefs and fisheries. I also know that hurricanes are getting stronger, much stronger, and they're dumping more rain. But we also know that the midsummer drought in the Caribbean, which is a natural phenomena, is getting stronger and longer as the ocean warms. So how are these things affecting people, and how are they affecting people differently in Grenada and in the Caribbean?
Ooh, interesting question. So for me, I come from the small island state of Grenada, as Catherine mentioned, and you would have heard Simon Steele mentioning what is happening in Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. But for us, climate change is really serious, it's really real. You can actually really go out right now and feel the impacts. One of the things that is happening, we have a lot, because we're mountainous, we have a lot of persons living along the coast, so we have a lot of coastal communities. But the interesting thing about these coastal communities, these are where you have most of the vulnerable persons living, not counting the hotels, etc. So when we talk about climate change and we talk about oceans warming and we talk about the effects on coral reefs, when you have persons living along the coast, their main income is from fishing. So a lot of them are fishers. When you talk to them, they mention to you that fisheries is what they know. They don't want to change to become farmers or anything else. They want to be fishers. And they mention all the issues that they've been seeing along the way in terms of, yes, the ocean is warming, but also the coral reefs are disappearing. They have to go out further now for fish. The fish are smaller, the catch is smaller. So there are a number of issues facing the fishers in these communities, and of course there's a spillover effect. But this is just only one part of it, because you have the oceans warming, you have the coral reefs dying, you have ocean acidification, but you also have the loss in terms of marine life, as I mentioned, and this affects livelihoods. Then we also have the issue of the long droughts during the summer. Again, this is affecting livelihoods, because oceans, small island states, we get lots of our water from the rain. If there's no rain, there's no water. We have rivers drying, we have droughts, long periods of droughts. We have, what is that called? It's not, I would call it load shedding, but for water. It's not electrical, but it's load shedding for water. So you have that issue as well. But most critical, I'm not sure how many of you would have seen the pictures going around. In the past couple of weeks in the Caribbean islands, we've been having rains. And with the rains comes the floods and comes the landslides, and it has been terrible. And it's not a lot of rain. It's not a lot of rain. Sometimes rain falls for 2 hours, but the destruction that comes along with it, it's really having an impact. So when you combine all these things together, you have the oceans, the temperatures rising, you have sea level rise as well, you have coastal erosion, and for us that is a really serious problem. And I think it's one of the most critical problems we're facing right now, because coastal erosion I mean, the land is going. So you have persons, as I mentioned, living literally at the water's edge. And when you have surges, or sometimes just heavy rains, or sometimes you have just like a little hurricane, the water is literally under their homes. We've had persons being removed from where they live by the government of Grenada because we had one hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Ivan in 2004. And with that hurricane came the storm surges, and all the houses moved from literally on the water's edge, and they were moved to the other side of the road. So you have their livelihoods being threatened because they have to go further now for fish, and the fish catch is smaller. You have their homes being threatened as well. You have lives being threatened. You have critical infrastructure being threatened. So for us, when you combine them all, it's a really serious problem in the Caribbean. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we are small island states, so we are bearing the brunt of what is happening.
If you notice when she was talking, what we're seeing is what I call not global warming, but global weirding, because you have this natural variability of rainfall, and it's being stretched in both directions. So the droughts are getting worse, and the floods are getting worse. And this is something we see where you live as well. So you were sharing how most of the rain falls in India, but the rivers come into Bangladesh. So when there is too much rain in India, they just let all that water go through to Bangladesh, and there's terrible flooding. We know that multiple times in the last decade, during the monsoon season, which is, the monsoon is normal and natural, up to a third of the country of Bangladesh was underwater, and that is not normal and not natural. But when there's drought, and there's a dam on the river, they can keep the water. And then you get even less water in Bangladesh. And that's not even talking about sea level rise. It's estimated that by the end of the century, if sea level rise continues to rise exponentially as it has the last 25 years, you could see a large area of the rice, a large part of the rice growing area in Bangladesh underwater. And even if it might not be flooded on the top, saltwater intrusion into the aquifers underneath are affecting fresh water as well. How is this affecting people, and how is it affecting people differently?
Well, as you said, India and Bangladesh, we share 50 plus rivers. So, as you said, during the drought, we also, the rivers in Bangladesh dry out because they keep the water for their own use. And during the rainy season, so they let the water go. So the waters come into Bangladesh, and we are flooded. So, it's really devastating. People cannot move, because we don't have that kind of preparation what to do when we have floods, And also, as you said, we also experience the landslides nowadays. It's because of many reasons. Because we cut the trees, because there is also, in our region, in Chittagong Hill Tracts, there are also population is increasing. So all those factors are there. And it also affects the health of women, like the water salinity, because the ocean water intrusion, and then they have to drink that water. There is no or very little pure drinking water. So it affects the reproductive health of women, especially in the coastal areas. That is we experience now. And in Chittagong Hill Tracts, because of the drought and no or less pure drinking water, the children, they are being affected some diseases like measles. So it affects in different areas of health, food system, because of all these, the indigenous communities, especially from Chittagong Hill Tracts, we cannot practice the traditional farming system, So that's why I think, these are the impacts, how differently it affects to us. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I learned some things there that I did not know. So lastly, in Arizona, heat is a serious problem. I mean, there's some days at the Phoenix airport when it's so hot that the airplanes can't take off because of the density of air. But drought is also a problem. The whole southwest United States is in a now 20-year drought that is the strongest and most intense in the last 1,200 years. And not only that, but you have so many people moving to a place that is already water scarce and already very hot. So how do you see heat and drought affecting people in Phoenix?
Sure. So Phoenix is very much on the front lines of the climate crisis when it comes to heat, drought, and I would also say air pollution is a big challenge that we face. The most significant impact that we have seen from extreme heat in particular is heat deaths. So between the overlapping crises of the pandemic, housing crisis, because our housing prices are skyrocketing right now in Phoenix with there being so much demand, we have seen a significant rise in our unsheltered population in the city of Phoenix. And unfortunately, that has also meant an increase in heat deaths that we're seeing every single year. So this past summer, Maricopa County, which is the county that Phoenix is part of, it's the second largest county in the United States, has several hundred confirmed deaths as a result to extreme heat, and several other additional hundred are under investigation as extreme heat being the cause of those deaths. And it's the majority of those are homeless individuals who are living outside, and it's very deadly. It's very tragic. We also see the impacts on other vulnerable populations, whether it's the elderly or low-income neighborhoods where, let's say, families can't afford to have air conditioning on all the time. So I think there was approximately 62 of those deaths that we saw this past year. So it's, I think the challenge and I guess the opportunity with heat is that I do believe that every single heat death is preventable. As long as we can make sure that as policymakers we are investing in the solutions for heat mitigation and for housing and making sure we can keep people safe. But it's been very devastating so far. We have a long way to go when it comes to our solutions. In Arizona overall right now we have about 50 dangerous heat days per year. And by 2050 it's estimated that will be around 80. So it's just getting hotter, and as you mentioned, more and more people are moving there, so we have to be very cautious about just the policies in place, making sure we keep housing affordable, make sure we invest in heat mitigation tools if we're going to continue to grow in a sustainable way.
So many differences in how we see people are being affected, but many commonalities as well. So now I want to turn to solutions. And I want to ask you, and I'll start with you right now. To be fair, we're starting with each one of the panelists. I want to ask you, what is already being done where you live, or what would you like to see being done that would help to build resilience? And, as you pointed out, how would that help address some of the inequities that you raised at the same time?
Yes, thank you. Especially the affected people, they are somehow adapting, and they are building their resilience because there is no way. They have to survive, It may be difficult, but they have to survive, they have to adapt. So adaptation is there. So building resilience is also there. Now the thing is, they also need support from outside, because it's sometimes really difficult for them to address all those devastating situation alone. So that's why it is important to work together. And as we know, the indigenous peoples all over the world and also in our Chittagong Hill Tracts, they have their own traditional practices to conserve the nature, to manage the land for sustainable livelihood, because they don't have any other option. They are completely dependent on the nature or land they have. So they know how to take care of that nature or land so that they can get their daily food, herbs as medicines. So they know how to take care of that area they live in. So that is there. Now the thing is, there is also challenges. There are also challenges like outsiders, they come in. It might be big, small, medium entrepreneurs or the state agencies or private sectors. They come in and that because the lands are not in many places recognized as the indigenous people's land. The government's claim is government's land. So there is conflict. So if the land ownership system is not recognized and respected and honored, then it's a big challenge for indigenous peoples to survive. So I think here when we talk about equity, we need to address in 3 areas. We need to work in 3 areas for equity. One is the visible things, what I have seen, no? And in 2 other areas, less visible or invisible things like cultural structure of the society, of the state. For example, the state's mechanism, the government's people or the majority people that do not understand the values of the indigenous peoples, the values of indigenous societies, the culture, the way they take care of the nature. Sometimes this indigenous knowledge is not science, but it is not proved yet whether it is science or not. But indigenous peoples, they know that there are linkages with their life and the nature. No? So that's why I think the mindset of the majority or the attitude, perspective of the majority people, I mean, in terms of power, need to understand and respect and change their mindset, change their attitudes. And same time, the structural things like laws, policies, acts, because in most cases what we see, the laws, policies and acts are either inadequate or discriminatory, or they don't ever, they never address, they never take into account the indigenous own system or policy or principles into the national law, acts or policies. So for equity, I think these things need to be addressed properly. Thank you.
Thank you. So people are already, indigenous peoples are already doing the right thing, but they need the laws and the policies to enable them to continue to do it.
Exactly.
Interesting. Excellent. All right. Niala, what is already happening or what would you like to see happen that would help make people more resilient and address inequities at the same time?
So quite a lot has been happening because as my colleague here mentioned, persons in these communities, for them it's live or die. It's a matter of life or death. So they are already taking matters into their own hands, trying to address some of the issues that have been happening. So in one particular community, and I'll just give an example where we work, we have seen persons, when I mentioned coastal erosion, we've seen persons put in tires and bricks and old construction waste, trying to address the issue of coastal erosion. So persons are already acting. There are also a lot of local actors on the ground, so you have local community groups as well, and they are already taking up the mantle in terms of what is happening. Again, you have NGOs coming in and trying to address the issues as well. So quite a lot has been happening, and I must underscore that the Nature Conservancy, particularly in Grenada, we're working on a couple of issues, but we're actually using nature-based solutions to address these issues. So it's not hardcore engineering, but we're actually intertwining hardcore engineering with a little bit of green engineering. So a lot of it is what we call hybrid. As I mentioned, the reef is dead and dying, so one of the things we're doing is a pilot to restore the reef to its height. So we'll have the wave energy come in, crashing on that, so we'll have less wave energy coming ashore and causing coastal erosion. And then, of course, there's mangrove planting. There's a lot of greening of the area as well, because for us, Nature Conservancy, Catherine, you know, we definitely believe in doing a lot of green. So there's a lot of mangrove restoration as well, and beach revegetation, etc. Now, just a point on that, because we know mangroves and there's seagrass beds in that particular area as well. When we talk about carbon sequestration, that is really coming into play. yes, it's a small island, but at the end of the day, every cent counts, right? So every bit of carbon sequestration counts. But in addition to that, we also have persons really trying to understand what the issues are and what role they can play. And he also mentioned women, and for us it's really critical that we get to the women, because when you talk about inequalities, these are the persons that really face the brunt of the issues we find, particularly in the Caribbean, coastal communities, a lot of informal settlements. So when you think about where are we going to pump our money, are we going to pump our money into informal settlements, or are we going to pump our money into areas that are already built up, like you have the hotels, etc.? Point to really take into consideration. One of the topics we heard along the way was insurance. When you talk about insurance, informal settlers, I mean, they don't have money for insurance. They don't have money for house insurance. So how is it that you would equate insuring their property versus insuring a hotel per se? And what are the benefits? What benefits would they be able to get? Yes, we have a hurricane, the house is gone. They stand to gain nothing. We have a hotel, the hurricane comes, they get damaged, they gain. So when you talk about the inequalities, it's also not just external, but you also have inequalities happening on the ground. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of local actors, persons trying, and they're not just sitting, but they recognize the issues, and they actually reach out and say, okay, we need help in this, we need help in that. Can you help us build capacity? You have the fishers, as I mentioned, along the coastline. You have the women, which is really important. You have the farmers, because when you look at the whole impacts, it's a whole system, a ridge to reef system, where you have whatever is done in the hills, it actually affects what is happening in the oceans as well. So there's quite a lot, and everybody is actually right now trying to play their part. You have the farmers with their retention ponds. So as you mentioned, when it rains, they actually capture some of the water, so you don't have that intense flooding happening in the towns. But then you also don't have all those minerals coming in and destroying the reef. The other important thing for me is so we have all these actors trying to play their part, or playing their part, which is really critical. But you also have the inequalities. And one of the things that is really important for us is, how do you really build capacity? So at the end of the day, when persons like us, like the Nature Conservancy and other NGOs, when we walk away from communities, how do you build that capacity so at the end of the day you leave them more resilient to the impacts of climate change? Because for us that is critical. How do they really understand what the actions that they're doing, how it impacts or how it affects their lives? And then you also have the policy level, which is really critical. So you have all these layers that you really need to tie in together, because it's a holistic solution that you're trying to address. But how do you address the issues on the policy level? And in Grenada, I'm going to talk a lot about Grenada because I'm from Grenada, but the moves have been made to really infuse nature-based solutions into policies, into legislations. But at the end of the day, you have to talk about enforcement. Yes, you have that, but how do you enforce that? So when you put the three together, you have the local persons on the ground really trying to do their parts. You have NGOs and you have other community groups coming in. And then you have the policy level as well. The solutions, there are a lot. A lot is happening now. There's still a lot more to be done to really make these communities and islands resilient.
I think you're really showing how climate change is an everything issue, isn't it? All right. What do you already see happening in Phoenix? And I know a few of the things that are happening there. I'm excited to hear you share. But what would you like to see more of, and how would that address some of the inequities you talked about, especially with people who are homeless, people who live in low-income housing who can't afford air conditioning, and people who live in mobile homes? Now, that was an interesting thing for me. So I'm Canadian, and mobile homes are not that popular in Canada because you can't insulate them that well. But they are very popular in the southern US because they didn't need a lot of insulation from the cold. Well, it turns out they do need insulation from the heat. And often people who live in mobile housing are not actually eligible for grants and programs to, for example, reduce their air conditioning bill or give them a temporary freeze on their bills. And so there's this whole sort of sector of vulnerability. So what's already happening in Phoenix, and what would you like to see happen in the future?
Thank you. I'm very impressed by your very specific knowledge of what's happening in Phoenix. So as you know, I literally decided to run for local public office in my hometown because of the work that I previously did at the UN. And I will say that I have very much still believe that cities play a very critical role when it comes to the solutions to climate change, especially as nature-based solutions as well. So one of the very first decisions and votes that I took post my election was to establish the world's first publicly funded Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. So in Arizona, in Phoenix, at our city, we actually have a dedicated Office of Heat Response. Unfortunately, the title is not Chief Heat Officer or whatever it was supposed to be, but we have an incredible director who runs that office. We funded it with several $millions. And the charge of this office is to come up with and implement solutions to heat and extreme heat in the city of Phoenix. They have done an incredible job so far. I think off of the bat, one of the main charges that they had was to come up with an exhaustive and comprehensive heat plan for summer 2022. And so they launched many different programs to establish cooling centers throughout the city for our unsheltered population and for anybody who needs it. We also, thanks to the Biden administration, had a lot of money come to Phoenix through the American Rescue Plan, which was basically a COVID relief package, several $100 million per year to the city of Phoenix and many cities across the United States, where the city council and the mayor got to decide how this funding was spent for COVID relief. And we actually decided to spend several $1 million for different tree and home weatherization programs. So planting new trees in neighborhoods and parks, also a program that is just now rolling out but goes back to addressing the inequities around vulnerable populations. And basically this program will help low-income neighborhoods upgrade their HVAC and air conditioning systems so that they have better rates and better utility rates and lower electricity costs. So that's very exciting. And then we also got to pass our climate action plan last year. And it was the first time the city of Phoenix passed a climate plan that was beyond just our own city operations, but in regard to the public as well. So in addition to very ambitious programs and recommendations around transportation electrification, decarbonizing buildings, we actually had strong adaptation and resilience points in there as well. So one of the programs that I'm very excited about is our Cool Corridor program. And the goal is to install 100 miles of cool corridors by 2030. And cool corridors is a fancy term for tree-lined corridors with ample shade, and the areas in which those are going in are areas with low tree equity scores. We have had great partnerships with organizations like American Forest, and a lot of private sector money come into the city to install these new cool corridors. The first one was in my district, which was very exciting, and the community is very excited about it. We have a lot of great partners on the ground at nonprofits who help us implement these programs. And finally, to your point around the mobile homes, that is a challenge that is quite difficult right now, and it kind of goes back to that point around the city's growth. So we're actually seeing a lot of developers come in from out of state and buying up these mobile home parks, and it's forcing folks who have lived there for decades out because they're completely wanting to tear it down and build luxury apartments. So that has been a whole challenge in and of itself. We are looking at every possible measure to protect those individuals so we don't increase our homeless population even further. So we're looking at everything from displacement funds to zoning measures we could take to protect those individuals. But it's a big challenge, that balance between the excitement of the growth, because we're definitely very excited that we're growing. We have a lot of great companies coming to Phoenix, a lot of sustainability focused companies, but at the same time, with heat being one of our biggest threats, we have to make sure that we're growing in an equitable way. So that's some of what I'm excited about. I would say moving forward, it's the funding piece that's going to be really important. So far in this year and a half that I've been in office, we've been lucky because of all of the money that we've gotten from the federal government to be able to fund these programs. When we reach a day inevitably where it's just our general fund, where the majority of that goes to things like our fire department and our police department, it's going to be a matter of making sure that we as a city continue to invest in heat mitigation solutions. And I think people want it. Like we see a lot of folks coming out to our council meetings and residents who are demanding, increased investment in these solutions because they're feeling the effects of heat.
So I think we've seen some very common themes here. Even though climate change affects us all differently, it affects individual people, who are already doing everything they can to adapt, but they're not going to be successful without the right policies, support, and legislation. And so the involvement of all of us as citizens is essential, because how does policy change? How does legislation change? It changes when people advocate for that change. So we have 3 more voices we're going to hear from in a different way before the end of the session, speaking from 3 other places around the world. But before we do, I just want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you, Catherine. We'll hear from Kevin in a second. I just wanted to take literally a minute, not take more time, because time is becoming of the essence here, but to take a couple of things that I heard. You know, climate change affects us differently. What works to address that? What works? What makes adaptation good? And how does a nature-based approach address this challenge? I think we need, finance is one of the issues, but more and more I'm realizing that the problems that the 3 of you talked about, they really also require putting equity at the center of what we are, of the challenge at hand. Niala, you brought up the issue of insurance. How can insurance be made meaningful for people who can afford it? If that cannot be made meaningful for people who cannot afford it, then it's not, in my opinion, a solution that we can scale. That's the other point, the scale. So for me, the work that we're doing on insurance as TNC really has to address the issue of equity or inequalities. And the payouts that come out of that insurance, the governance of that insurance scheme, has to directly address issues of inequality and vulnerability. And that also means understanding vulnerability from a much more complex way than from simply or solely a biophysical part of it. So that combination is really what's important in order to design a proper nature-based approach that will take adaptation in an equitable direction. I think that's kind of what I took from the experiences that you shared, and I found it really insightful, so thanks for that. But I want to ask you, Kevin, why don't you join me here? Kevin is the Africa Climate or Africa Forest Carbon Catalyst Director. Whew. And by the way, I should have said, I am the Global Climate Change Adaptation Director at TNC. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Kevin, welcome. I'd love for you to give us a sense, of what this means, what you heard from an Africa context, because, this is a COP in Africa, and how does the issue of nature-based approaches and equity resonate with you and the situation in the context in the continent?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'll begin with what would have been my 2 words, my 2 words, first of all, would have been drought. Where I come from in Kenya, at the moment, about 23 out of 47 counties are really affected by effects of drought. 3.1 million livelihoods directly affected, social nets, safety nets lost. We are seeing livestock, wildlife dying. And to the west in Nigeria, just a few days or a few months ago, more than 1.4 million people were displaced as a result of floods, and more than 600 people lost their lives. So I'm looking at 2 words here, drought and also floods. But having said that, from the panel, I realized there is a lot that is already going on. There is a role to tap into the indigenous people's knowledge. There is a role of enabling environment around policy, tenure rights, governance systems, amongst others. But there is opportunity in Africa. If you're talking about nature-based solutions to tackle climate adaptation, for example, we have 45 million to 50 million hectares under agroforestry in Africa. We have 700 million hectares of forest land in Africa, and almost 500 million people dependent on these ecosystems. But further looking at more or less related to the Caribbean, we have 26,000 kilometers of coastal line, and 25 out of 30 countries along the coastal line that are planting and conserving mangroves. So already there are small-scale pilot projects that have been done, even through the support and funding from the Nature Conservancy, addressing water security issues, source water protection, fire management, improve range practices. But those are just pilot projects. We need to move them to scale across ecosystems, across geographies, at speed and at scale. What I'm looking at is, for Africa, most of the nature-based solution enterprises require a little bit de-risking, especially the first 2 to 3 stages, where some of the projects either are vulnerable or don't take off the ground. So we require a purpose-built financial vehicle, blended capital approach, where we attract private investment by using public resources, first of all. 2, there is need for more dissemination of knowledge from the indigenous people to the other, other interest groups, and also from academia, from science to, and vice versa. So the role that knowledge and capacity will play. The other one is addressing the long-termism or the long-term nature of adaptation projects. So typically you find adaptation projects would take several or multiple years to, to realize economic or environmental benefits. So how to, tackle these qualitative issues, but also present them in a meaningful way to address the societal problems. So in a nutshell, I think there is an opportunity. There's just need to, we just need to mobilize and provide, concerted efforts at a multiple scale across all the terrestrial, marine, and all the sectors. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That really gives a great context of, the African reality. And I'd like to use the last few minutes. We have a video, Catherine, but I wonder if you want to share that first question that we had thought about while I set up the video, and give people a little chance to think about it, and come back to us after we have set up that, after they have watched the video.
So it's early in the morning. You need to wake up a little bit. So I would like you to turn to 2 or 3 people next to you and share an example of how you have seen resilience working where you live. What is working or what isn't working where you live? Go ahead. 2 or 3 people at a time in your little groups.
I was a little bit thinking, like, do we play the videos? Or,
And then,
because we have the it's 9:50 something, so.
I know. I think of this.
Yeah.
Just this and then
Yeah.
video.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. It all works out. You just
Yeah.
have to do things on the fly every time. If there's someone in your group who hasn't had a chance to talk now, give them a chance. Mi pregunta favorita es, dime algo que oíste de otra persona en el grupo.
Sí.
Not your own opinion, but what you heard from
exacto.
somebody else.
Está bien. Sí, sí.
Yeah. Because then that's active listening. And also, it makes you feel appreciated when somebody listens to you and then they share your thoughts.
Yeah. It means a lot more than if you say it yourself. It's true.
It's so much better. Yeah. I always do that with groups now.
Do you also teach? Do you have like lectures and?
Well, so before COVID, I started to put my classes online. So I have recorded all my lectures. Last semester was the last semester that I was recording lectures, and now I'm not recording any more lectures for 2 more years.
You're gonna do it in person?
No, it's recorded.
So now it's
yeah,
there. Okay.
Yeah. So it's online classes. Yeah. But even last semester, I was doing a new class that I had to record the lectures for.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. So is the video ready?
it's
Is this
ready.
the right one?
Yeah.
Okay.
The one with the two colleagues.
PNG.
and South Africa.
Okay. All right, I hate to stop this because I can see all the really good conversations happening and I would love to know what you're saying. But we have one more voice we want to share before we end. And this voice is from Papua New Guinea. So please watch this last video that we have to share from what's happening in Papua New Guinea.
I'm Louise Stafford from the Nature Conservancy.
South
and I'm
Africa
the
and
South
PNG.
African Country Director. Nature is our biggest ally in combating climate change. It provides natural barriers against climate-related shocks, such as droughts and floods. The Greater Cape Town Waterfront restores the watershed upon which over 5 million people in the region depend for their water. 2/3 of the watersheds are invaded by alien trees. This results in water losses of up to 50 billion liters of water every year. It also increases the severity and extent of wildfires and associated biodiversity and soil losses. By removing the invasive trees, we harness the power of nature to help the region to adapt to climate change and ensure water justice.
I'm Robin James from the Nature Conservancy. I'm the Director of Gender and Equity for our Asia Pacific region. We know that mangroves are so important for storm surging, for protecting low-lying communities from buffering, from soil erosion, etc., from coastlines. But we also, what is not as well known, is that these are incredibly gendered spaces. So the parts of the world where I work, where mangroves are so important, it's really women who are the ones who are using the mangroves for their livelihoods, for fuel for their fires, for shellfish for their families, but also they're the ones that have this intimate knowledge of how important they are. But often decisions are made at the policy level and we know that less than 30% of women and even less are involved in climate negotiations and policy development. So our project has really been working with women at the local level who are the most impacted by climate change but often have the least say, to think about how they could manage their mangroves so that they're a really, really important nature-based solution to protecting their villages and their livelihoods, but also so that we're influencing policy, so that these women have an opportunity to influence policy around carbon, around blue carbon for mangroves, around how development is situated around mangroves. And so they've been really, this work has enabled them to be invited by, for example, the Climate Change Development Authority in Papua New Guinea to really sit down and work with them on how we can develop national policy that not only protects mangroves but also benefits women who are the most impacted if those resources are lost. So for me, the thing I've learnt the most, and it's a call to action for my organisation and all the organisations that are involved in climate, is that we need diversity in leadership at all levels. We need to be thinking about equity from the very top to the very communities that we work in. It can't just be thinking about women in the community level. We have to be thinking, where are women in our organisation, where are women at the top level, and where are women in these climate negotiations, because that's how we will get a better planet and better solutions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Danielle, and thank you everyone for coming. This is being recorded as well as live streamed, so if you need to watch it or share it later, it will be available. Could the panelists come up for a photo, please?